kids. Today we are going to talk about Wikipedia research and Pamor. I've got some pictures to go along with that, so stick around and we'll find out what that is. Okay, let's take a moment and talk about the type of information you can find on Wikipedia about knives, swords, their history, and metallurgy. It all sucks. Okay, it's not all bad, but the problem is that even I can write a Wikipedia article. I went in and I started an account on Wikipedia. They verified my email address, and about 45 seconds later, I was making changes to an article on Bill Moran. And I didn't have to provide a bibliography. I just made the changes and then put in there, why I made them, and that was it. Changes done. So, I think some of the information looks good, and it's definitely convenient. It's at the top of our search engine results for just about everything. But obviously, this is not serious research. This is not dependable research. And I think in doing some reading, for example, on Pamor, if I go and look at some of these topics on Wikipedia, I can already see some glaring errors. I get comments on the YouTube channel all the time where I can just tell people have been to Wikipedia because it's the same regurgitated stuff coming back at me, and it's pretty bogus, especially on Damascus. There's some really bad information on Wikipedia about Damascus and Woots, and even the internet at large has bad information on that stuff. But at any rate, when I look at it, and I do look at it, it's not that I ignore it, I use it as a jumping off point. I basically, as I'm reading it, I'm telling myself, well, that could be true. It might not be true. In essence, anything you read there, you're going to have to corroborate through a different source. And so I think it's good to get some leads and a place to start. Maybe look at the bibliography stuff at the bottom. Sometimes there's some bibliography information and you can go directly to those sources. I basically read it thinking I'm going to have to verify everything I see. I'm highly skeptical. So much good metallurgical and weapons history tied up in the story of Pamor Steel. Pamor is this ornate, beautifully laminated steel used to make the culturally significant kris or keris dagger in Indonesia, a practice that started sometime in the 13th century, they think. Indonesia is a chain of about 12,000 islands, some rather large, off the coast of Asia. And Malaysia is part of the same island chain. Basically, this is halfway between Vietnam and Australia. And it's huge from a population and landmass standpoint. There's 250 million people there right now. Of course, the most interesting thing about Indonesia for me is this steel, this laminated pattern welded steel used almost exclusively in this ceremonial and ornamental type of dagger. A Chinese expedition to Indonesia in 1416 notes that the king carries one or two short daggers called the pulak or kris. Men have a pulak stuck in their girdle. Everybody carries such a weapon from a child of 3 up to the oldest man. The daggers have a very thin strip of whitish flowers and are made of the very best steel. The handles are gold, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so Pamor, what that? A French archaeologist named Leroy Gorin divided Pamor into 3 groups. He called them simple, true, and Corroy Fin, Corroye Fin, Fin. Simple Pamor, he said, was also known as Indonesian Pamor or Rambut or hair Pamor, and it's a flat bundle of rods or wires welded together, and the pattern is revealed with various acid etches, and he notes the presence of scale inclusions amongst the individual wires as being part of the pattern. He says that most of these look like coarse hair running the length of the weapon. Leroy Gorin notes that a similar pattern and construction is seen in Tibetan sabers of the 19th century and modern-day fakes in Indonesia for tourists. The second type, he says, is true Pamor, which was made from bundles of alternating layers of different types of metal, usually 2 types, which were hammered into thin plates, stretched out, cut to length, restacked, hammered, stretched out, cut to length, blah, 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 and you build a layer count. And then that layer count is otherwise distorted by twisting or some other means, and this would be called pattern development in modern day. He said that often enough they were welded onto a flat core of hardened steel for the edge, which sounds like sanmai to me, and they were etched but not heat treated, so they weren't quenched. The most valuable Pamor was made in the royal court with meteorite iron plus regular iron or steel, the significance being that the particular meteorite iron available to them was high in nickel content, as is most forgeable meteorite iron. a lot of meteorites are not forgeable because of all the contaminants inclusions, high silica content, but those that are tend to have a high nickel content. How much meteorite iron is floating around Indonesia? At any rate, in more recent centuries, the Indonesians have started to scavenge like bicycle parts with high nickel for these knives, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The third type is Koroi fin, which only contains a few layers located mostly near the edges of the blade. It's been found in 19th century Caucasian knives, Indonesian swords, and Japanese knives, and it's an intermediate form, he says, between the first two. Isaac Groneman was an obstetrician from the Netherlands who traveled to Java, Indonesia, where he became the private physician of a sultan. And in his 1904 book called Pamor Smeedkunst, he details about 48 pattern subtypes of Indonesian Pamor, and he lumps them into sort of 5 major groups, and you can see the picture. Each pattern, he said, imbued the dagger's owner with some power, such as enemy's eyes will blur, or gives a profit, or safe everywhere. The number of styles was expanded more recently to 70. I think that's just fascinating that that's empowering the user in some way. It's pretty awesome. So Groneman witnessed the decline of the Chris tradition and the meager wages that the smiths who practiced the tradition were able to earn. He said it left them in poverty, basically. So he started this personal campaign to save the cultural heritage of the Chris and Pamor, which he says was essentially becoming extinct around this time. The main issue was the extreme expense of the desirable meteoric nickel, so he advocated replacing it with some other less expensive sources, and ultimately he found and tried pure nickel leaf, or thin pure nickel, and he got the local smiths to sort of embrace that, and they found that they could recreate their patterns effectively with that. But it never really caught on. There wasn't a whole lot of support for it. And he apparently committed suicide at the age of 80, sort of distraught over some of the things he was seeing in Java and Indonesia. Now, this is interesting to me because does the decline of a culturally relevant materials craft due to rising costs and alternative modern technology or techniques sound familiar, right? There's a cultural shift, an economic shift, and a long practiced form is being lost. It sounds like the decay of Binti steel in China or even Woots in India and its failed adoption by Europe. It's like the same story being played in a different part of the world, sort of at the same time in the case of Woots. Is this the predecessor to modern pattern welded steel? I mean, the finest Pamor had one nickel containing steel plus another one that didn't. It involved pattern manipulation with twists and folds and cutting. I don't know, man. It sounds a lot like it. But it's probably not the derivative of modern pattern welding. Pamor does exist in Persia, where it's called pulad. There's some debate on whether or not it's spread from Persia to India, or to India to Indonesia, or Persia to Indonesia, or whether it developed in Indonesia independently of outside influences. Regardless, in his paper on the subject, Hans E. Wuff, W-U-F-F, specifically gives the name Pamor to laminated, pattern-welded Damascus as made in Persia and elsewhere. So yes, the modern-day ornamental pattern-welded steel has existed a very long time, and not just with the Vikings. It existed in Persia, it existed in Indonesia, it existed a lot of other places. He notes it was made of one of two ways in Persia, one by thin strips of raw steel being carburized on their surface by repeatedly sprinkling a mixture of hornmeal and charcoal while it was red hot, then forging the carburized strips into a rod which was stretched and folded repeatedly. It sounds a lot like Pamor we heard about in Indonesia, like our hair or rambut Pamor. So for swords, he says that rod could be cut on end repeatedly and pieces laid out next to each other and forge welded together to form a repeating pattern with curls in it. That's mosaic Damascus. Isn't that amazing? That is mosaic Damascus. So the author also notes that this technique was used even modernly. He says that in Tehran in the 1930s, daggers and hunting knives of particular quality and fame were made in this way. He also notes the second method of damascening steel in Persia was pattern welding of a carbon-free iron with alternating layers of steel. He believes evidence exists that both were manufactured in Persia in pre-Islamic times, and he cites a reference by Al-Kindi, the Muslim philosopher from 800 AD, who basically refers to male steel called sakani and female steel called bishamahani. I'm totally butchering those, but basically he says those two were forged together to make a single steel, and Wolf sort of implicates this as being a reference to lamination. We'll see here in a minute that that's not a very far-fetched connection to make. So there's Persia. What about India? I don't know how far back a tradition like this might go in India, but there's a British captain in 1825 named T.M. Bagnold who writes about an account his brother left him, who was also a captain from Bombay. And he submits this to a journal where it's published. And basically his brother witnessed what he calls artists in India take iron hoops from English casks. So the scavenged steel, it's awesome. And the more corroded with rust, the better. And if they weren't rusted, the Indians would actually soak them until they were. They were cut into foot-long lengths, stacked 1 to 1.5 inches high, and forge welded. That was drawn out, cut, doubled several times before being turned on its edge and forged flat, and then etched, and there's further manipulation there. And he describes swords made in similar fashion using charcoal and iron for flux. Okay, so let's go back and pick up a little more of the history of lamination. What about the ancients? In Notes on Prehistoric and Early Iron in the Old World, a gentleman named H.H. Coghlan did a technical examination of a spearhead dated to the Achaemenid period, found at a cemetery in Syria. And this was dated about 500 BC, roughly. It has 50 layers of 0.18 to 0.6 carbon steel in it, and 3% nickel in most of that. And it showed a surface carburization that resulted in watermarked patterns similar to Damascene crucible steel. And many would refer to this particular process as faggoting, which is a type of piling whose purpose was to uniformly incorporate many pieces of steel into one. So the pieces were drawn out, hammered into a similar shape, basically put on top of each other, welded together, folded, and repeated. And again, that's a way of homogenizing the characteristics of the steel. So in this case, the maker would have recognized that some of the iron he was getting was more like iron, and some of it was harder, more like what we call modern steel. And he wanted to incorporate or uniform those characteristics throughout. And so that would be faggoting. 500 BC, that's pretty amazing. There was no hardening or tempering of the spearhead. And there's a big debate on how and when intentional carburization first started, as opposed to sort of this incidental carburization that happens in the bloom. For example, there's a period of making bloom iron where there's a lot of reduction going on, and the exterior surface of the bloom might be well carburized, but the inside might not. At any rate, there's just this wonderful ornamental pattern welding technique that harkens both back to the Iron Age and even resembles our own modern day efforts at Damascus. I think that is just truly fascinating. That I don't know that it's a bridge between these two eras or whatever, but it just shows how old things are. I don't know. It's just really interesting. What do you guys think of Pamor? Have a good one.